The body on the penthouse floor hadn't even gone cold yet, and the only person in the room who wasn't screaming was the woman refilling the water glasses. That woman was Darcy Ouellet, 26 years old, 270 pounds, a hotel housekeeper from Verdun who had picked up a waitressing shift at the Château Frontenac's private dining suite because her landlord had raised the rent again, and her EI hadn't come through. She needed the money. She needed it badly enough to wear the polyester uniform that cut into her waist and the shoes that were half a size too small, and to smile at men who looked through her, like she was a piece of furniture that happened to be breathing. She had been invisible her entire life. She had simply never realized until that night that invisibility could be a weapon. The man who owned the suite, who owned, in fact, most of the illicit cargo moving through the port of Montreal, was named Callum Renaud, 51 years old, silver-threaded hair cut close at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table, nursing a glass of Armagnac, watching the chaos unfold around him with the same expression a man might wear while reading a mildly disappointing newspaper. 3 of his associates were dead on the floor. His enemies had walked into the suite through a service corridor that was supposed to be locked, shot 2 of his guards before anyone had drawn a weapon, and then been shot themselves by the 2 guards they hadn't gotten to first. The whole thing had taken 11 seconds. Darcy had counted. She had been standing at the credenza by the far wall, her back to the room, pouring mineral water into crystal glasses, when the door burst open. She had not moved, not because she was brave. Because her brain, operating on pure animal logic, had calculated that the people doing the shooting were not interested in the fat woman holding a water pitcher by the window, and that moving would only draw attention to the fact that she was there. She had been right. Nobody shot her. And when it was over, and the room smelled like cordite and copper and the expensive cologne of men who were no longer breathing, Darcy set the pitcher down carefully on a coaster, because she had been raised right, and her mother had not crossed the Atlantic from New Brunswick to raise someone who left water rings on mahogany, and turned around. Callum Renaud was looking at her. Not through her. At her. She had never had a man like him look at her like that, and she was not naive enough to think it had anything to do with her face. "You didn't run," he said. His voice was low and accented faintly with the particular Quebecois cadence of someone who had spent decades speaking both languages and had let them bleed into each other. Not a question. An observation, the way a man notes an unexpected variable in a calculation he has already run 3 times. "I didn't want to get shot in the back," Darcy said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more restrained than that and more dangerous. "Practical," he said. Extremely. He tilted his head slightly and his dark eyes moved over her, not the way men usually looked at her, when they bothered to look at all, with that particular blend of pity and contempt that she had learned to swallow down like cold coffee. He looked at her the way she imagined a chess player looks at an unexpected move from across the board. Curious. Recalculating. "You've been working this floor for 3 hours, Callum said. "What did you see before they came through the door?" Darcy blinked. Around them, his remaining men were murmuring into earpieces, moving bodies, doing the quiet and efficient work of people who had cleaned up messes like this before. None of them were paying attention to her. She was the housekeeper who'd picked up a shift. She was nobody. "The man with the grey jacket," she said slowly. "He went to the washroom twice in 40 minutes. But the washroom is down the hall, and he was only gone for about 90 seconds each time." "That's not long enough to actually use it." Callum's eyes sharpened. "He was checking the service corridor," Darcy continued, "because she was already in it now, already committed, and she had always been the kind of person who, once she started talking, finished the thought. Both times he came back, he touched his jacket pocket. Not reaching for anything, just checking, like he was confirming something was there. "You noticed that," Callum said. "Flat, careful." "I notice things," Darcy said. "People don't look at me, so I look at them. You accumulate a lot of information that way." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. One of his men, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit who moved with the coiled efficiency of someone who had served in something, stepped close to Callum and murmured something. Callum didn't take his eyes off Darcy. "Leave us," he said. The man hesitated for exactly half a second, then moved toward the door. The others followed. The suite emptied out until it was just Darcy Ouellet and Callum Renaud, standing among 4 dead men in the most expensive room she had ever been in. "You work housekeeping at this hotel," Callum said, "and waitressing when they need coverage. Your name?" "Darcy, Darcy," he repeated, and something about the way he said it, like he was weighing it, filing it somewhere, made the back of her neck prickle. "How long have you worked here?" 7 years. He swirled the Armagnac once, though he didn't drink. 7 years cleaning rooms and listening to conversations that were never meant for you. It wasn't an accusation. It was something closer to an inventory. "I don't repeat what I hear," Darcy said carefully. "I know," Callum said. "If you did, you'd have been dealt with a long time ago. Half the men who've stayed in this hotel work for me or work against me. You have heard things in 7 years, Darcy, that could bring down 3 governments and end 11 careers." He paused. "And yet here you are, still changing sheets." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, another skill she'd developed. Callum set his glass down on the table. He walked toward her, and she held her ground, because she had learned long ago that backing down when someone walked toward you only told them that you could be moved. He stopped a meter away. Up close he smelled like dark wood and something faintly smoky, and the particular kind of money that doesn't need to announce itself. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and your answer matters more than you understand right now." Darcy's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. She kept her face still. "Ask," she said, "a man like me." His voice was quiet, deliberate, each word chosen and placed with precision. "Has his hands in things that would make the people at this table tonight look like amateurs. I corrupt and I coerce, and I have built an empire on the suffering of people who never knew my name. You have spent 7 years cleaning up after men like me." His eyes didn't move from hers. "So, tell me, Darcy, why did you not simply let them kill me?" The question settled over the room like snow settling over the St. Lawrence in January, slow and absolute. Darcy looked at the bodies on the floor. She looked at the crystal glasses she had arranged on the credenza an hour ago, still perfectly aligned. She looked at Callum Renaud's face, which was waiting, entirely without urgency for her answer. "Because it wasn't my call to make," she said at last. Her voice was even, certain. "I'm not a judge. I'm not God. And I've spent enough of my life watching people decide that someone like me should take up less space in the world. Less food, less room, less noise, based on nothing but what I look like. I don't make that call about other people based on what I think they deserve," she paused. "Also, if a firefight had broken out with me in the room, I would have been dead, and I'm not done yet." Callum stared at her. The silence was so long that she became convinced with a cold and matter-of-fact certainty that she had said the wrong thing, that whatever he had been looking for, she had not provided it, that the next thing that happened would not be a conversation. Then he said very quietly, "Not done yet." "No," Darcy said. Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle enough that she almost missed it. A loosening at the corners, a fraction of warmth moving through the controlled, calculated mask of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. "No," he echoed. "I don't imagine you are." He picked up his Armagnac again, crossed to the window, and looked out over the lights of the old city. Quebec spread below them in the dark, the plains of Abraham lit faintly at the edges, the river a black ribbon in the distance. "I have a problem," he said. "Someone inside my organization has been feeding information to a rival family out of Toronto. 3 operations in 2 months, each one precisely targeted. Whoever it is, they know my schedule, my routes, my people." He turned. "My inner circle has been with me for over a decade. I have torn it apart looking for the source. I find nothing, because whoever it is, they are careful enough to know what I'm looking for." Darcy folded her hands in front of her, an old habit from years of standing in rooms where she was supposed to disappear. "And you need someone they're not looking for." "I need someone they would never think to look for," he corrected. "Someone who can be in a room, and be so thoroughly ignored that the people in it forget to edit themselves. She thought about 7 years of changed sheets and overheard conversations and the way rich men spoke openly in front of hotel staff because they had decided, somewhere deep in the part of the brain that doesn't bother to justify itself, that the people who cleaned up after them weren't really present in any meaningful sense. "That's a very specific kind of ugly job you're describing," Darcy said. "Yes," Callum agreed, "it is. And if someone figures out what I'm doing—" "They won't," he said, "because you'll be with me, and no one touches what's mine." She should have said no. Any reasonable person would have said no. She was a housekeeper from Verdun with a bad landlord and shoes that were half a size too small, and the sensible thing was to walk out of that suite and go home and never speak of this night to anyone. Instead, she said, "I want a number. What you're asking isn't minimum wage work." And Callum Renaud, for the first time that evening, smiled. The next 4 weeks remade Darcy's life in ways she hadn't been prepared for, though not in the ways she'd expected. Callum moved her into a suite at a private residence on the plateau. Not his home, which she didn't see until later, but a secure property managed by 2 of his people, with a kitchen stocked by someone who clearly understood that food was not a moral failing. He didn't put her on a diet. He didn't suggest she might want to take advantage of the building's gym. When his tailor arrived to put together a wardrobe for the events she'd be attending, the man made the mistake of pulling out dark fabrics and boxy cuts, the universal costume that the world had been dressing Darcy in since she was 15. Callum walked through the room on his way to a call and stopped. "No," he said without breaking stride. The tailor blinked. "Monsieur Renaud, for a woman of her, she's not hiding," Callum said and kept walking. Darcy stood very still in the middle of the fitting room while the tailor recalibrated, pulling out emerald silk and deep burgundy wool, and a charcoal blazer cut so precisely to her actual body that when she tried it on, she looked like herself for the first time in years. Not a slimmed-down version of herself. Not a version of herself squeezed into something designed to minimize. Just herself, wearing clothes that had been made to fit who she was. She did not cry, but it was a near thing. Not everyone in Callum's world received her the same way. His second-in-command was a man named Aubert. Sharp-faced, 50s, the kind of lean that came from discipline and a long history of not trusting easily. He had been with Callum for 18 years and wore it like a credential. The first time Darcy sat in on a briefing, Aubert looked at her the way people had been looking at her since she was old enough to understand what that look meant. She was used to it. She used it. Because Aubert, she noticed, was careful in front of Callum. But when Callum wasn't in the room, Aubert stopped being careful. He made calls from his office with the door 3/4 closed rather than locked. He spoke freely in front of staff, the same way wealthy guests had spoken freely in front of her for 7 years, because he had decided, without examining the assumption, that the people who weren't worth watching weren't watching him. Darcy was always nearby when Aubert made those calls. She had spent a lifetime learning how to be nearby without being noticed. The event that broke everything open was the spring gala at the Fairmont Queen Elizabeth, the kind of evening where Montreal's legal money and its illegal money dressed up in the same rooms and pretended the distinction was meaningful. Callum brought Darcy as his companion. She wore the burgundy dress the tailor had made, and diamonds that Callum produced from a case with the same casual efficiency with which he produced solutions to every other problem. Standing in the lobby of the Queen Elizabeth while cameras flashed and men in $10,000 suits gave her the particular look that said they were deciding whether she was a joke or a threat, Darcy felt something she hadn't expected. She felt dangerous. "Ready?" Callum said quietly beside her. "Point me at the room," she said. She spent the first hour doing what she did best. She found a chair near the corridor leading to the private conference rooms, the kind of chair that faced the wall rather than the crowd, where a woman could sit with her feet aching and a glass of sparkling water and look, to anyone who glanced over, like she was simply resting. The server who passed by gave her a sympathetic nod. Women like her were always resting at parties like this. Everyone expected it. She was not resting. 40 minutes in, Aubert slipped out of the ballroom and down the corridor. He was followed, at a discreet interval, by a man Darcy recognized. Thierry Canton, the city councillor whose campaign Callum had bankrolled 6 years ago, and who had since demonstrated a talent for looking the other way at the right moments. Behind Thierry came 2 men she had not seen before, but whose posture she had learned to read in 7 years of observing people who moved through the world like they expected it to get out of their way. Darcy stood up. She smoothed the burgundy dress over her hips. She walked back into the ballroom. She found Callum at the bar, holding a glass of water, listening to a judge tell an anecdote that everyone around him was pretending was funny. She caught his eye from across the room. Her right hand rested briefly at her collarbone, a gesture she had described to him 3 weeks ago in a conversation that he had absorbed with the complete and total attention of someone who understood that details saved lives. He excused himself from the judge within 30 seconds. In the corridor outside the ballroom, she told him everything, fast, precise. Aubert's contact, the Toronto men. The corridor they'd gone to. Callum's face did not change. This was something she had come to understand about him. The stillness wasn't coldness. It was the thing that happened when a man who was always processing finally had the piece that completed the picture. Beneath the stillness, she could see it. The thing that happened in the eyes of someone who had trusted for 18 years and was now absorbing the full weight of what that trust had built and what it had just been used for. He cupped her face in both hands, briefly, and pressed his mouth to her forehead. "Stay in the main ballroom," he said. "Don't leave until I send Deschamps for you." Then he was gone. An hour later, the gala was still technically ongoing, though the energy had shifted in the particular way that energy shifts when something has happened, that most people in the room can feel but none of them can name. Darcy sat by the windows, watching the reflection of chandeliers on the polished floor, and waited. Callum came back through the main doors at 11:47. His suit was as perfect as it had been 3 hours ago. There was nothing. No soot, no disarray, nothing readable on his face, except the particular calm of a man who had done what needed doing and closed the door behind him. He walked through the entire room, past the judges and the city officials, and the developers who laundered money through condos on St. Catherine, past the wives in gowns and the mistresses trying to look like wives. He walked through all of it in a straight line that everyone moved out of, without quite knowing why. He stopped in front of Darcy. The room had not gone quiet. This wasn't a movie, but the immediate vicinity had developed that particular quality of people pretending not to watch something they were absolutely watching. Callum took her hand. He didn't kneel, because that wasn't who he was, but he stood close enough that the gesture was unmistakable. A man who did not make public declarations, making one deliberately in a room full of people who would repeat what they saw. "I have been building this organization for 23 years, he said, low enough that it was for her, but not so low that the people nearby couldn't hear. "I have had loyal men, brilliant men, careful men. I have never had someone who could walk through a room and come back with the truth of it." He held her gaze. "They spent 18 years making sure I was surrounded and never looked at what was behind me. You walked into this building 4 hours ago and found it in 40 minutes. He didn't call her his queen. He wasn't the kind of man who spoke in those terms. What he said instead was quieter and more devastating. You are the most valuable person I have ever worked with, and I want you to know that I know it." Darcy looked at him. She thought about the hotel rooms she'd cleaned for 7 years, the way men spoke in front of her without caution, the uniform that was never the right size, the shoes that never quite fit, the decade of being exactly what people expected her to be so thoroughly that they forgot she was there at all. She thought about what it was worth, all those years of being overlooked, what it had quietly, invisibly accumulated into. "We should discuss my rate," she said. "Given the scope of the work, and Callum Renaud, crime lord of the port of Montréal, the most feared man in 3 provinces, laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised him. The people nearby stared. They would talk about it for months. The powerful man laughing openly in the middle of the Queen Elizabeth ballroom, the woman beside him who didn't bother to perform modesty about the fact that she had earned it. Darcy Ouellet had spent 26 years taking up space in a world that had tried very hard to convince her she was taking up too much. She had listened and watched and filed away every careless word spoken in front of her, every assumption made, every room she had been written out of before she'd even walked in. She had been invisible for so long that she had become something far more useful than visible. She had become indispensable. And the monster standing beside her, the one who corrupted and coerced and had his hands in things that would make reasonable people lose sleep, had been the first person in 26 years to look at her and see it. In her world, that counted for something. In her world, that counted for everything.